Haras Rafiq, who is a citizen of Great Britain and a noted authority with great interest in the subject of radicalization and extremism. His particular beat is his own community, which is the Muslim community. We will have speakers whose interests are expand beyond that community. We're going to have Robert Wistrich at some point, who is a world-renowned scholar of anti-Semitism from the Hebrew University. Joseph Telushkin, who is more of a popularizer, but an extremely important writer on Jewish themes, including books on the theory of anti-Semitism. And I think really we picked a very interesting group of speakers. Mr. Rafiq is the founding director of something called CENTRI, which is Counter-Terrorism Consultancy, Training, Research, and Interventions, an organization based in Great Britain, is that the case, that attempts to deal with problems created by terrorism and other forms of extremism, focusing, this is not a political event, but focusing on those with that particular problem within the Muslim community. There will be people who will focus on European anti-Semitism and other worldwide issues about anti-Semitism, but tonight I think, if I'm not mistaken, Mr. Rafiq is going to speak about the particular problems that have arisen to a large extent, a more modern issue than ancient anti-Semitism, because the particular problems have arisen largely in connection with the founding of the State of Israel, events that were before and after that. That has produced an increase in anti-Semitism within the Muslim community. I don't think that's a politically incorrect thing to say. If it is, I'm saying it anyway. I think it's a clear fact. He has also been the founding executive director of the Sufi Muslim Council and a member of the UK Task Force on responses to 7/7. We had 9/11. 7/7 is the date on which the horrible bombings occurred in London. And Mr. Rafiq, has been on the commission to evaluate the British response to that. He's been an advisor to prime ministers, including the current prime minister and the prior prime minister, to secretaries of state. And I located a juicy quote about him from the Secretary of State for Education, which calls Mr. Rafiq a pious Muslim and a true patriot. I would like to think that nobody would ever bother to say about me that I was a pious Jew and a true patriot, but I would like to think it's true. Without further ado, I'm going to ask Mr. Rafiq to come. He's going to speak and have a PowerPoint presentation. After his remarks, we will open the floor to remarks from you and comments and questions. I don't know who you are, some of you, and I don't know whether you're going to agree or disagree with the things he said, but this is an academic environment, an environment in which free speech within broad bounds will be honored and recognized, and I'm here not only because I'm a professor at the school, but because I'm a black belt in judo, and I'm going to enforce civility on this robust and tough-looking audience. Without further ado, Mr. Rafiq.
Can I have my notes back, please?
Oh, sure. It's so fun when you have notes. No challenge.
Thank you, Richard. My thanks to Richard for the introduction to Columbia University and also to Charles from ISGAP for inviting me on, I think, this inaugural session and the first, I hope, of many on an important subject on how anti-Semitism can be combated, but generally racism, extremism and radicalisation as well. What I'm going to talk about today is really pathways to extremism and radicalisation, and focus primarily on, I guess, my own communities, which is the Muslim communities in the UK and around the world. And I want to start off with a little bit about my own background and how I got into this. I remember, born in the UK, 1965, lived there most of my life, went through the usual things that immigrants or some children of immigrants went through living in the West, working in the corporate sector, not really focusing on this until one day my daughter, who's an image of their photograph there, came home, and she was about 6 or 7 at the time, and she said, "Daddy, I don't want to be a Muslim." And I said, "Why?" And she said, "Because Muslims are always angry, they're always killing people, they're always burning Guy Fawkes." And I said, "Well, show me where you're getting these messages from." And she flips over onto the television, and there were some guys who happened to be Muslim, who were very angry. It looks as if they wanted to kill somebody, and they were burning effigies of George Bush and Tony Blair. And this started a process of self-reflection from my part. Here is a girl who was very young, coming from a practicing Muslim household. She didn't know anything about ideology, she didn't know anything about theology, she didn't know anything about the other. She just knew that she didn't want to be angry, and she didn't want to hurt anybody. So this started a series of questions also around what is it that other Muslims must be thinking, and just as important for me, what is it that non-Muslims in the UK and around the world are thinking of us now as Muslims living in the West. And what I'm going to talk about today really is the culmination of over 8 years' work. And the basis of the presentation really is extensive study of former radicals, looking at the research and engagement with the research that's been done in the UK and abroad, 7 years of counter-terrorism intervention work which has been undertaken with the police, the probation services, community referrals, through a process called Channel in the UK, and other forms of interventions, observations of the data that have been gathered over the last 10 years, and the 120 plus cases that have led to convictions in terrorism within the UK, and Islamist terrorism in particular, and looking at theoretical studies undertaken by colleagues and researchers looking at psychological constitution and sociopathy. What I'm going to talk about today is, what is Islamism? What's the difference between Islamism and traditional Islam? Is there a difference? Look at strategic radicalisation. Look at some of the pathways and tactics. Look at some of the institutions. The importance of anti-Semitism within this radicalisation. Combating violent extremism, which is, I guess, the response to terrorism that the US has taken. Look at some of the analysis and lessons learned from the UK, and then just some recommendations as well. So what is Islamism? Well, Islamism essentially is a political ideology which actually tries to assume a more or less single interpretation of faith as a political creed and system. It looks at medieval political point of view with modern ideological assumptions, but within a modern framework, medieval political mindset, and pre-modern laws. Islamism looks to set up a caliphate. An example of some of the ways that Islamists would like to rule under a caliphate would be the Muslim Brotherhood's victory in Egypt after the recent elections that took place, and the subsequent draft constitution when it was altered, where Article 2 regarding the role of Sharia was changed to, and the principles of Islamic Sharia are the main source of legislation, was what it was originally, but now then it was changed to, and Islamic Sharia is the main source of legislation. Subtle difference, but a key difference in terms of interpreting a particular theological and ideological viewpoint. In essence, Islamists, amongst other things, want 3 things. To create an Islamic state with their version of Sharia as law, and again, the Article 2 from the Muslim Brotherhood Constitution promotes that. Expand the state to take over the world, whether it's now or whether it's later, at some stage. I guess the rest of the world, if that ever came to be, wouldn't want it to happen and would resist, so the use of force at some stage would be necessary. And thirdly, wipe Israel off the map. Mixed with theology, Islamism is a political viewpoint that is designed and needs an enemy to fight. So what's the difference between traditional Islam and Islamism? Well, just as there's a difference between social and socialism, social being a word used for people living together, and socialism being the stage in Marxist-Leninist theory, which is sort of intermediate between capitalism and communism. Islam and Islamism is different as well. The first is a monotheistic religion characterized by the acceptance of the doctrine of submission to God and to Muhammad, peace be upon him, as the chief and last prophet of God, versus Islamism, which is a political ideology holding that Islam is not only a religion, but also a political system. Islam traditionally, as stated, has been primarily a way to God, a composite of spiritual traditions. Islam is diverse in its interpretation of Sharia, the extent of Sharia, the application of Sharia, and the concept of Sharia. For example, Al-Azhar University in Cairo recognised that there are over 432 legitimate interpretations of jurisprudence of Sharia. And Islamism assumes a single type of enforcement of Sharia through either the modern state or revival of ancient empires. Let's look at Muslims in the West. According to the Pew Research Centre, there are approximately 45 million Muslims living in the West, various heritage, mainly Asian, Turkish and African, less Arab than you would think, although in the US, recent estimations say that approximately 20 to 25% of the Muslims living in the US are from Arab origins. Most Muslims living in the West have poor Islamic education. For example, when I went to mosque as a youngster, I essentially learned two things from the mosque. One, how to incorrectly pronounce the Quran, and secondly, how to carry out my daily obligations. Same thing is still happening amongst the mosque institutions in the US and the UK and around the West. But what this means is that as Muslims in the West grow older and explore their Islamic identity, there isn't enough resilience to extremists who might portray an anti-Semitic, hate a form of Islam which is extremist and verging towards violence. The demographics of Muslims in the West is younger. For example, according to Salford University, a recent study taken about 4 years ago, over 70% of the British Muslims are under the age of 40. That's a significant demographic figure to look at. There is a lot of misdirection by political scholars who like to call themselves Islamic scholars, and some of that comes from the Middle East, some of that comes from Pakistan, etc. Tensions between communities are growing. There is more and more fear and distrust. When I was younger and growing up in Britain, there wasn't this element of faith-based identity politics. People never regarded or measured me by my faith. People either thought I was British or didn't like me, it was Pakistani origin or Paki or whatever, but never as a Muslim. Nowadays, we actually tend to fall into the trap of measuring people by their faith, and that's something certainly that Islamists don't want us to do. There isn't enough English language mainstream, moderate, and I don't like the word moderate, but I'll use it to highlight, because to me, traditional classical Islam is moderate. But there isn't enough literature and voice, and not enough voices. There's a lack of understanding of Western Muslims, and vice versa. There is a growth in anti-Semitism, but let's not forget that anti-Semitism existed in Europe long before the Muslim world, and some commentators believe that it's been absorbed into some of the Muslim traditions for political use. And again, some Muslim organisations have given youngsters the belief that there is a concept called al-wala al-bara in Arabic, and that's loyalty and enmity for the sake of God. This is to actually hate somebody who is different to you. That can be other Muslims or non-Muslims, but especially people who happen to be Jewish or of another faith. So let's look at strategic radicalisation. Well, the problem with radicalising somebody is that one has to look at implementing extreme ideology across the board. To accept Islamism or extremism, Muslims have to actually reject the peaceful heritage that they had of their parents and grandparents, and it's not an easy conversion. The only way to make this conversion is to change the Muslim mind, and that's exactly what extremists aim to do, not only in the Muslim world, but also in the West as well. The tactics that they use are the same in the UK, the US, and around the world, and that's really a series of creating a series of organisations and institutions, each with its own objectives, controlled by complicated web interlocked directories. Similar to the way that communists, I guess, used to organise dissent and win control of trade unions and peace movements. In this case, however, the targets are mosques initially, religious schools, Islamic centres and media. So what do they do? Well, one of the things that they actually do is to set up institutions through funding through the Middle East and a number of places, and try and teach youngsters that the faith that their parents and grandparents had fits into one of four categories. It's bid'ah, haram, shirk, and kuffar. What does that mean? Innovation, it's not allowed. The practices are associating a false deity to the practice of Islam, and it's taking somebody to a state of non-belief. A little story around this. I remember around about 2009, I was engaged in a speaking tour up and down the UK and around Europe, and there was one particular chap that came up to me after a presentation. He was from Pakistani origin, and he hugged me and he started crying. The Britishness in me wanted to sort of push him away, but the Pakistani in me sort of tried to hug him, so it's sort of half-hearted pushing away and hugging. And then he told me a story, and it really astounded me. He moved and migrated to the UK as a youngster with very little education, and he undertook manual work for most of his life. As most immigrants, when he had children, he wanted his children to do well and move up the social ladder, so he was absolutely pleased with himself when his son managed to gain a place in a university, a very prestigious university, to read medicine. So not only was all of his hard work, as far as he was concerned, paying off, but his son would be able to actually earn more reward for him within the community as well. Within the first year, his son used to come over and he started, talking about Islam a lot more, even though his father was quite secular, and he started asking about questions about Islam, and started wearing his clothes in a particular manner, and started actually growing a beard, etc. So the father thought, you know what? Not only is this double whammy, not only is this guy going to be a doctor, but he's also going to be a much better Muslim than me as well. Second year, the guy came over and started getting political, started talking about Israel, Palestine, started talking about Iraq, Afghanistan, and a whole range of things. But then he started doing something which was quite interesting. He lived at home, and at dinner time, what he would do is he would separate his food into two halves. He would eat one half, and he wouldn't eat the other half. So eventually, after a few months of this going past, the guy got his wife, the mother, to ask, why was this happening? What's going on? And eventually they got to the bottom of it. This youngster had been radicalised to such an extent that he believed that because his father was wishing the next door neighbour a Merry Christmas, he was doing something which was a bid'ah, which meant that he was doing something that was haram, which meant that he was doing something that was causing him shirk, which took him outside of the fold of Islam. However, because he wanted to practice the greater jihad in inverted commas, he had to stay alive. So what he would do was separate the food, and he'd say one half of it he won't eat, the other half he will, because that's what he needs to eat to stay alive to perform the jihad. And the real reason why this parent was crying wasn't because of this, it was because one morning they woke up and they found a note that this young lad had wandered off somewhere in Afghanistan and was off to fight the jihad against British and US forces, and he's not heard from them since. And this is really part of the stage one. Second stage, which I'll actually look at in a bit more detail, is the setting up of a lot of organisations and institutions within society, each claiming to speak for different parts, and umbrella organisations at the top. And the third part really is the movement of finances through shell companies, which are designed to effect this radicalisation at a fast pace, but avoid detection. And I guess a lot of it is coming from the Middle East. And there is a CIA document that says that over $80 billion has been spent by one country alone, Saudi Arabia, in propagating this particular theology and ideology around the West. And again, this whole process is designed to create a rapid ideological change. So what is this example of phase 2? Well, if you look at the right-hand side of the triangle, underneath we have a lot of organisations, institutions. On the right-hand side, which is, I guess, the violent, angry side, and the left-hand side is the more sort of middle-class aspects of society. This is something that's happening in the UK, the USA, and around Europe as well. On the right-hand side, let's look at some youngsters, and this is around how organisations are set up to attract people, Muslims, to their own cause. If there happen to be some youngsters who are maybe ex-drug addicts, involved in crime, a bit more violent, organisations that are set up which actually actively go out and recruit these youngsters and reform them. On the left-hand side, most British Muslims, most Western Muslims, most US Muslims just want to go out and have fun, maybe play a bit of sports, hang around. A number of organisations, sports clubs, weight training clubs, gyms, etc., etc. An example of this is the lead bomber 7/7. He was actually doing his radicalisation and recruiting from a gymnasium in Yorkshire in England. Let's go up the triangle on the right-hand side. Activism within university. When I was young and I was in university, I wanted to ban the bomb. That was the thing that was the radical thought in the early 80s. So universities have always been a place where radical thought has been explored. There are a number of organisations which will take this activism within the Muslim, Western Muslims' minds and actually bring them to their own angry, anti-Semitic, hate-based, homophobic viewpoints and actually start getting them to publish things at university. On the left-hand side, again, people at universities, when I was at university, I wanted to do other things other than banning the bomb, but I knew that at Ramadan, I became particularly religious, and this is quite common with Muslims. We may do nothing in terms of being observant Muslims throughout the whole year. Come Ramadan, we'll start fasting and doing things that Muslims want to do, only for the month though. So a number of organisations will set up events for the average secular Muslims to bring them in. Again, on the right-hand side, angry lobbies after people at universities, institutions. Then you get the political elite and the social elite, and a number of umbrella organisations at the top. The line on the right-hand side is very important. And that is where blockers, influential blockers, have been set up by these organisations and players to block the majority of non-extremist Muslims from getting into the playing field. I'll give you an example of this. In Bangladesh, the Islamist organisation, the Jamaat Islami, used to be a political entity that used to hold elections. They were banned recently, although they've sort of reinvented themselves and come in a different format. But when they were a party, they only used to have a handful of seats in parliament. But they controlled the bureaucracy, which meant that the power that they wielded throughout society was much more disproportionate to the actual power that they had. In the UK and the US, there are people who are from an Islamist background, Islamist supporters, who are actually blocking the majority of mainstream Muslims, who aren't sitting at home thinking, the answer to whether I'm going to pay my mortgage or not is Israel-Palestine. The answer to whether my children are going to do well at school or not is what's happening in Iraq or Afghanistan. This is the average Muslim. And these guys, because they're active, well-organised, well-funded, are actually in place, providing disproportionate access to politicians and other influential players within society to what they actually represent in terms of their representation. So what are the pathways? Well, essentially, a lot of people, myself included in the past, have often spoken about a single trajectory that actually moves people towards radicalisation within the Islamist traditions. That sort of dynamic and all of that does happen. There are four things that I've actually observed and my colleagues have observed. The first one really is that people are radicalised to an extent where they believe that there is a worldview that the West is at war with Islam. There is a selective observation of political issues and grievances, and this leads to the accepting the plausibility of violent ideologies as normal and appropriate to the world. This then sees the extremist ideology as the only ideology and a reading of its religious text that are constant and resonant with the world as it is. These individuals aren't often drawn to the Wahhabi or Salafi theology of jihadism, but to the political projects and activities as being a manifestation of fighting the war against Islam that has been perpetrated by the West. Whether it's the cartoons, irrelevant films, the wars in the geopolitical East, or many of the other myriad of examples often cited, they're all viewed as examples of this. Acts of terror are seen in the same light as a response to this war, intellectual, political, and military-wise. Second pathway is theological terrorism. There are individuals with a full-blown belief that the Islamist ideology is the only valid political reality that Muslims can accept. They believe that terrorism is a form of jihad or struggle to remove governments and their supporters, i.e. the West, from Muslim majority countries, or what they would refer to as Muslim lands. Israel is a classic example of this, although there's a paper that I'm doing with ISGAP, which will be coming out fairly soon, which will be a theological and ideological refutation to Hamas and the Comparative, which will sort of help to overcome some of those. These pathways are specific, theologically driven aims, and they believe that they have an authentic reading of medieval Islamic scripture. They believe that this category of people can only be engaged by people with a relative theological expertise to demonstrate that the views that they hold are inauthentic and are a heterodox reading of scripture. The third pathway really is that there are individuals in the world in the UK, USA, who may be of an Iraqi, Afghani, Pakistani origin, who may have had some previous experiences. These could be collateral damage caused by drones involving our troops, or personal experiences of treatment in the UK or USA, which makes these individuals personally susceptible to violent ideology. These individuals are often motivated by a sense of moral indignation. And finally, the fourth one, there are people with general mental health problems. There are people, convicted terrorists, who are easy targets for radicalisers and recruiters to actually bring people to their own viewpoint and actually move them towards a particular viewpoint. The individuals can be radicalised at a very fast pace, but what are the tactics that they use? Well, we talked about the manipulation of creations of grievances. There is an ability by these recruiters to intermingle with people who have similar concerns or similar beliefs but are less radical. This is done in order to give them legitimacy and also to present themselves within people who are vulnerable to their recruitment. There is a targeting of and selection of brighter individuals who are more accepting of the core and belief system. The grooming takes place through individual mentors. The leadership figures actually maintain a bit of a distance, but are still engaged for motivational purposes and for selection of specialisation and specialness and commission. The recruiters seek to focus on the four pathways and then look to provide solutions to these people that they can actually identify with. So the other tactics, well, the radicalisation, typically to the four pathways, tends to take a particularly common route. This is not the only route, but it seems to be the most common. The first one is presenting somebody with a personal crisis. This can be a perceived personal crisis. The organisation that I work with, we have a network of former radicals and extremists, and one of my fellow directors used to be a recruiter for Hizb ut-Tahrir. And he often cites the story where he was on the train one day, and when he was recruiting, he happened to see a mother with a young child with a newspaper, and the headline was paedophile. And that's all he needed to see. He started a conversation engaging with this woman on the fact that how paedophilia is becoming more of a problem within the West, and created this personal crisis, and then presented her with a prism through which the only solution to her personal crisis was a lens, which is Islamism. And again, the theology and ideology. This woman then went on to be a major recruiter herself for a number of Islamist organisations. And then once people believe in this prism and join the group, they're actually encouraged to become specialists and take on certain tasks for sustainability and build capacity for their cause. And finally, getting people to internalising values and support for violence, which is a big step, but as I'll show in a diagram later on, it's not a bigger step from somebody who actually holds views which may be racist or anti-Semitic or angry or Islamist in nature to get into that point. And again, it's all about dehumanising the other, the concept of the word kafir and kufr, which I'll talk about in a little while. But at the beginning, there is no full disclosure of the ideological parameters, nor of the violent means that are embraced. Mosques themselves, in my opinion, mosques aren't the major source of radical activities as they used to be, and that's down to a number of exposures. But still, there needs to be some caveat around that. There still are mosques which allow extremist groups to operate within their parameters. For example, Hizb ut-Tahrir holding Arabic classes in a number of mosques in New York, in Washington, and a number of other places as well. There are some mosques which are led by people who support extremist ideologies. There are activists who are not necessarily part of the mosque itself, or will operate from there. And there are some institutions where their theology is sympathetic to certain brands of terrorism and extremism. The internet, experts are divided by what they see as internet radicalisation, but in my work I've certainly come across certain cases that I would like to share. There are individuals who already have a cause motivation and they will use the internet to find more information. There are individuals who are seen it as a method or a means of anonymously spreading their ideology and theology. It's a means for people who may have a form of personal crisis, be it racism, be it whatever it is, to actually look for a group to belong to. And again, it's a way for people to find other like-minded people who may have certain areas of vulnerability. And of course, it is a means for discreet communication, often spreading of propaganda as well. For example, Al-Qaeda's magazine Inspire, which is in the English language, is often used to and transmitted through the internet. Universities is an interesting one. An interesting statistic from a recent study by the Henry Jackson Society looks and analyses that there used to be a belief that it's only the Muslims in the West who are suffering from lack of education, who are suffering from poor social conditions, that are actually going out and becoming terrorists and supporting extremism or radicalisation. But in the UK, 47% of convicted terrorists attended universities. 6 convicted terrorists were former presidents of Islamic societies in the universities. Universities themselves, many universities will actually accept extremist preachers on campus to come along and deliver sermons. Now, I'm not saying that we should ban these preachers or we should curb the free speech within the universities, but there needs to be some form of counterbalance. At this moment in time, there are extremists who are floating within universities, and there's no counter-narrative that is being given to young, vulnerable Western Muslims. And again, not enough counter-campaigns. Prisons are a bit of a unique situation where there are many instances where the belonging to a group within prisons has meant that there have been moments of gangs, has meant there have been forced conversions. For some reason, some prisons tend to lump people in with belonging to certain ethnic groups and origins. And of course, sometimes people will lump other people, they may be from a Pakistani background, they may be from an African American background, they may be from an Arab background, will lump them in with other Muslims. Of course, also floating in the prison are radical extremist preachers who are in there for recruiting and radicalising in the first place. Well, this gives them an open playing field for them to recruit. So let's look at anti-Semitism. Manuel Tahawi, an Egyptian New York columnist, calls Israel the opium of the Arabs. It's an intoxicating way for the Arabs to forget their own failings, or at least blame them on someone else. Arab leaders have a long practice of using Israel as a pretext for maintaining states of emergency, both at home and putting off reform. An example, at a meeting in 2005 in Amman, an American official suggested that it was time for an Arab democratic spring. The Pavlovian response from Amr Moussa, who I've met, the Secretary General of the Arab League at the time, was this: there will be no spring or autumn or winter or summer without solving the Palestine problem. We want our friends in the United States to know that this is the consensus in the region. This viewpoint, this Pavlovian response, and this wanting to blame their own failings on Israel, and hence then Jews, is a way of fueling anti-Semitism and then spreading it around the world. Anti-Semitism within the scriptural, or the scriptures. There are apparently texts within the Quran and Hadith which justify taking hostile attitudes to people of the book, especially the Jews. An example of one is, take them not as friends and allies, awliya in Arabic, they are friends and allies of each other. There's another hadith that the Hamas used to radicalise Muslims both in the Middle East and around the world, where it talks about the end days of killing Jews, and that the end time will not happen until there will be a war against Jews, and that rocks will cry out, and certain trees will cry out, "Oh Abdullah, there is a Jew behind me, hiding behind me, cut off his head." Yeah, these scriptures do exist, but they've been taken by Islamists to be A, general, B, applicable today, and C, to describe people not based upon actuality, but essentially on their nature. The reality is that that verse and that hadith that I mentioned the verses are not age-specific, they're not applicable to the Prophet's time in many cases, and certainly not in the world today, and they're related to certain incidents and tribes, and not to a character of people. Traditional scholars do not view these teachings, these scriptural messages, as modern Islamists do. A key word that's used is kufr and kafir. There are verses within the Quran that actually talk about, mention the word kufr, or mention the word kafir. Traditionally, traditional classical Islam has actually said that the only person that can be called a kafir is somebody by God, and then only if they refute the truth, they hide the truth. The word kafir in Arabic means to denote from the verb to hide the truth, is when somebody knows the message of one God, and then somebody, through obstinacy, through haughtiness, through arrogance or pride, decides that they're going to reject it. In fact, there is a great quote from the respected Sheikh Shaltut from Al-Azhar University that says, whoever does not believe in these doctrines is not a Muslim. La yakun Muslim. And the Islamic rules regarding Muslims do not apply. This does not mean that such a person is a kafir with God, but rather that such a person is not requested to perform the obligations imposed by God upon Muslims in terms of religious rituals. This is something that traditional classical Islam believes and Islamists don't. And I mentioned the killing of Jews towards the end time. It's a hadith that's been taken as Kabar Ahad and contradicts Islam per se. And in fact, there was a similar saying amongst Jewish traditions, and Maimonides was asked a similar question at the time of the coming of the Messiah, will Muslims and Jews be united? And he answered yes. All people of true faith will follow the Messiah. And that's what that hadith actually looks at as part of a collection of hadiths, and it's been taken in isolation by Islamists to radicalise young Muslims and make them anti-Semitic, and hence view the world from their particular lens. Again, a counter example, another counter argument. So, often Israel comes up whenever I'm talking to my fellow Muslims and others as well. The Quran actually, some people don't realise, the Quran actually recognises Israel. And in the Quran chapter 17, verses 100 to 104, we believe as Muslims that God says Pharaoh sought to scare them, the Israelites, out of the land of Israel. But we, God, drowned him, I'm talking about Pharaoh, together with all who were with him. Then we, God, said to the Israelites, dwell in this land, the land of Israel. When the promise of the hereafter, end of days, comes to be fulfilled, we, God, shall assemble you, the Israelites, all together in the land of Israel. Traditional classical Islam believes that this prophecy has now been fulfilled. So again, looking at the classical role of classical theology, certainly the role by great Muslim scholars like Ghazali, Razi, Suyuti, believe that anybody, whoever he or she may be, who is sincere and is saved, will be saved either directly or by intercession, therefore cannot be a kafir. And again, certain Salafi scholars, people like Ibn Taymiyyah and Shawkani believe that all those who make efforts to find the truth will be saved based on God, on the fact that God doesn't place a greater strain on somebody than they can bear. And again, there are problematic statements found in medieval scripts, but these are the exceptions rather than the norm. And again, there is a whole history of a role played by Jews and Christians in narration of Quranic exegesis, and this is, there is a whole authentic hadith where the Prophet, we believe, Prophet peace be upon him, said, "Adatu anhum wala haraj." And away from them, we're referring to the Jews and the Christians, from there is no harm. So therefore, there is a tradition of Israeliyat which has been expunged and purged by Islamists and Wahhabis and Salafis. An example of this is the tafsir, a commentary by Ibn Kathir, which has been tampered with and edited to remove this from the heritage. Just touching on to a sort of final section, there is a response from the US, which is called Combating Violent Extremism. What's the origin of this? Well, there was a study that was carried out in the UK and the US, If you look at the graph, there is X%, and it varies from which country you look at, of Muslims that support directly Al-Qaeda. Then there is Y%, which will sympathise, and then there is Z%, which will empathise. The shortest time noted by security agencies in the UK, in Canada, and in Holland, of individuals travelling from a position of empathising with violence and terrorism to actually supporting it is 1.5 weeks. That's quite scary. The whole concept of combating violent extremism is really to move that graph to the left and build resilient communities. So what is it really? It's basically a failed version of the now defunct Preventing Violence Extremism strategy in the United Kingdom. The violence extremism strategy focuses on violence and not the ideology. It allows the partnering and empowering of extremists who do not outwardly display violence. This is happening in the USA right now. It allows the funding and the using of taxpayers' money to organisations that are not outwardly violent, but disagree with shared American values. For example, liberal democratic societies, political participation, women's rights, death to apostates, although they do put a caveat around that, in Muslim lands, etc. This helps to build the capacity for non-violence extremists. It gives credibility to extremists. Senior politicians attend platforms, as the US ambassador, sharing a platform with known extremists that the UK government has decided do not fit around the UK government's table because they're anti-Semitic and support Islamist, hate-based theology and ideology. They give credibility to senior politicians, and of course they believe that there is a role played for a role that non-violence extremists can play in de-radicalising violence extremists. But a question, really, an open question. Do I want my tax dollars to go to organisations? Do I want my government to support organisations that believe things like no Muslim should serve in the US or any other nationalist army, and particularly at the time when he or she could find themselves firing on fellow Muslims? Do we want our money going to people who believe that participation in parliament is a sin? Do we want our money to go to organisations? Do we want our support to go to organisations? Do we want our governments to support organisations that believe that living under man-made laws is a sin, and anybody who does that or doesn't believe that is a disbeliever? Do we believe that there's a death penalty? Do we want to support people who believe that anybody who converts from Islam to Christianity or another faith, although in an Islamic state, should be put to death? Do we believe that our support and taxpayers' money and empowerment should go to organisations that have all of these beliefs? Well, I don't believe they should, and I'm sure that most sensible people would believe the same. Why, in that case, are governments in the West, the US included, not cutting funding, not supporting people who are classed as non-violent extremists? Why would they stop supporting people who are classed as non-violent extremists? Because to cut the funding and cut support is not demonisation of Muslims, and this promotion assumes that the default position for Muslims is extremism. And I actually find that quite patronising as a mainstream, moderate Muslim living in the West. So what hasn't worked also? Well, in the US, CVE, as the old PVE, the use of using non-violent extremists to be radicalised jihadis. Numerous instances. There was one in Luton, a guy called Al-Abdali, who was a suicide bomber in Stockholm. He went to an organisation, a mosque or institution in Luton, where he became a regular member part of the congregation. This particular institution is being supported, or rather was being supported by the government, as a bulwark against terrorism, but they weren't able to stop him. In fact, they didn't even to spot the fact that this guy was potentially going to blow himself up. This thing is happening now in the US. There are people in the US who are being supported by the US government who, on their own websites, believe that suicide bombing is justified as a legitimate military tactic in the Middle East. There are people in the US and around the West who are being supported by the government, by your government, by my government, well, not so much by the UK government anymore, that believe that attacks on US and British troops in Iraq and Afghanistan is legitimate. These people believe on their own website that attacks on women in Western countries are justified. And this really is a dangerous notion that the only way of bringing or winning back these violent jihadis is by using these non-violent people. The policy and the strategy now is involved in the original putting together of the government's response, and now in the review a couple of years ago as well. It's no longer preventing violent extremism in the UK. It's now called PREVENT. And it's just preventing ideology. The ideology of far-right extremism and the ideology of Islamist extremism. It's about three I's, looking at ideology, interventions and individuals. Not just Al-Qaeda, but names Islamism as a dangerous ideology within the Western society. British government no longer engages with organisations that do not espouse shared British values. We've banned preachers who purvey anti-Semitic, hate-based, Al-Qaeda supporting rhetoric from coming in the UK, although here in the US you allow them to go into 50 million households via satellite TV. Great. We in the UK have cut funding and support from these organisations. No minister, UK minister, is allowed to share a platform with non-violent extremists. It's not everything, but it is a step in the right direction, and there's more to do. So very quickly, with the last 5 minutes. What are the recommendations? Well, more interventions are required around the individuals, around the institutions, and around the ideology. Very, very important. It's not happening. There needs to be a more focused, developed approach to actually providing these interventions, and not really isolating individuals from their human needs, but working alongside the mainstream services in dealing with the individual. There needs to be adaptive styles, but there needs to be a coming together of the society as a whole, people who are American Muslims, people who may be American Jews, people who may be American Christians, or people of no faith, coming together and recognising that this is a problem for the whole of the community. Recognising that there is engagement and there is partnership. Engage with everyone. You know, sometimes we need to engage with somebody to debate them. We'll need to engage with people at universities, and I do this in the UK, as do a number of my colleagues and around Europe. We will go to universities and actually engage with extremists to debate them, and let the audience make up their own mind. A lot of my Jewish friends believe that, you know, we really need to engage and partner with people that don't like us. Well, guess what? Islamist organisations are anti-Semitic, and this will not change. It is in their DNA. Islamism, especially from the Mufti Hussein Amini from Jerusalem onwards, has to have anti-Semitism in its ideology, otherwise it will not exist, because the third goal that they have is to wipe Israel off the map. The Islamists, by partnering with these groups, will achieve political cover, legitimacy and protection, and their primary target is not to sit down with people who may be of a different faith or different heritage and work out real practical solutions, but you know what? To build their own capacity. My own request to people is that you don't partner with Islamist organisations and actually sell out liberal, moderate, mainstream Muslims who still are the majority here in the USA and around the world. Work to be done. There needs to be more work in looking at the traditions of contemporary views of anti-Semitism within modern day Middle East and the Arab world and non-Arab Islamic countries around the world as well. I mentioned that there is a study which, a draft version has gone to Charles, which we're looking at the theological and ideological reputation of Hamas and the Israeli Tabari. More work around that needs to be done. There needs to be religious stances by people, by scholars who happen to be Muslim or non-Muslim, against political positions which are racist or anti-Semitic or extremist. And again, you know, recognise that the reality of Islamist movements around the world really is coming from, the growth of Islamist movements is coming from the USA. You may look at me and think, well, how come? Well, in the Middle East, Islamist organisations really have been banned virtually from the inception. They don't know how to exist in the Middle East by a myriad of dummy organisations and dummy names. the ideas, the intellectual ability to actually proliferate ideas around the world is coming from the USA. Islamist organizations from the USA right now, undercover, under the political cover and legitimacy provided by the US government and other organizations, are pumping out this anti-Semitic, hate-based rhetoric funded by Middle Eastern money around the world. And London, is one of the places where this is actually now being propagated from. So I guess we need to do more in the USA. And again, looking at the impending problems of political Islam, what is the difference? Understanding that to criticize a political interpretation of a faith, in this case, be it Islam, doesn't necessarily mean that I don't like the word Islamophobia, but I'll use it. Doesn't mean that you are Islamophobic. There are people who are Muslims that will criticize. I think it's wrong for society to say, well, it's okay for me to, as a Muslim, as a practicing Muslim, to stand on a platform and say, political Islam has this problem, such and such a Muslim is anti-Semitic, such and such a Muslim is racist, or etc., etc. But if somebody who isn't a Muslim said it, they'd be branded Islamophobic. That's wrong. Look at the ideas and look at the actual the rhetoric and the narrative that's coming out from an individual rather than actually who's saying it. And I think that an alliance, a broad spectrum alliance of people is needed, so I should take this on. I'll just move on fairly quickly. I think this is the last slide. I think the government, and again there's a paper coming out on this as well, again through ISGAP, look at the government position, the US government position about how they are combating violent extremism and learn from the lessons of the failed preventing violent extremism strategy in the UK. Don't give political legitimacy to non-violent extremists, don't fund them, don't support them, engage with them rather than partner with them, and desist from the strategy of using non-violent extremists to de-radicalise violent ones, and don't just focus on Al-Qaeda, because 60% of convicted terrorists in the UK don't actually have any Al-Qaeda in them. And I'll take questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Haras. That's a dazzling presentation. I think we could show it again at midnight and again at 6 tomorrow afternoon to absorb the whole thing. But really, we thank you. I'm happy to monitor the taking of questions. I might want to ask the first one, take the privilege myself of being called the convener, which subjected me to a criticism that hasn't materialized yet. But my first question would be, to what extent do you think that this is a historical cycle in Muslim history that has been enacted in the past? And I'm asking that in particular to ask to what extent do you believe that the Palestinian-Israel conflict is at the center of this, or simply an excuse in certain circles to fight perceived injustice with terrorism?
I'll take the second part of that question first. I'm going to say something quite controversial. I believe that Israel is Dar al-Islam, not Dar al-Harb.
Is
Dar al-Islam, the house of Islam, not the house of war. Basically, I believe, as traditional classical Islam believes, that because Muslims in Israel, and I've been there many times, Muslims in Israel are allowed to be the 5 pillars. Muslims in Israel are allowed to eat their food, be it halal food or kosher food. Muslims in Israel are allowed to practice their own method of the sunnahs of marriage, etc., as per the fatwa issued by one of the greatest scholars from the Indian subcontinent, Imam Ahmed Raza Khan Bareilly, where he was asked a similar question about British rule in India, and he said that because all of these things apply, India under British rule is a house of Islam, therefore theologically it is wrong for Muslims to attack Britain, to attack India, or attack Britain for it. Similarly, I believe, as traditional classical Islam does, that Israel is a house of Islam because of all these things apply. Let's go back to the other aspects of this. There's a problem in Israel and Palestine. Of course there is. I'm not going to say that there isn't. Israel as a country does things well, and Israel as a country does things not so well. That doesn't mean that Israel doesn't have the right to exist. It has a right to be criticised for the things it doesn't do well. And I think that this is something that, this nuance is something that is not acceptable to Islamists. The use of anti-Israel and anti-Jewish rhetoric is something that is key and fundamental to Islamists to create a scapegoat and to rally support to their own viewpoint and their own ideology of hate around the world. Not just the Arab, but around the world. Of course, there are things happening in the Middle East. If you talk to Israelis will say that there are Palestinians who are doing things that are, causing them harm, and vice versa. There will be things that Palestinians will say Israelis are doing things that will cause them harm. Sure, there's a problem. The only people who can fix the problem are the people that live there, in my view. But that doesn't mean that people should be anti-Semitic. That doesn't mean that Muslims should be anti-Semitic. But unfortunately, since I mentioned Mufti Hussein, Amin Hussein, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, who actually sided with Adolf Hitler during World War II, who had a reaction to Jews moving back to the Middle East, to Palestine at the time, and sort of took this view that he will take European anti-Semitism and incorporate it as a number of scholars have talked about. Berman is one of them, and a number of others who've said that this European anti-Semitism really has been absorbed into Islamist theology and support. Because let's not forget, Islamism isn't that old. The Salafi Wahhabi theology is only a couple of hundred years old. And Islamist political ideology is less than 100 years old. So it's not really a history or a cycle in terms of actual theology and ideology, but it has existed in pockets, I guess, in pre-modern times in the past.
Some of its fanaticism, that it says it had an ancient enough tradition.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you look at the Ottomans and you look at sort of before them, there's always been fanaticism in a lot of, in most religious, points of view.
There was a question over here.
Factually, you mentioned something about American allowing 50 million viewership. Were you referring to Al Jazeera?
That was one of them, unfortunately. Al Jazeera.
So my question would be, what do you think of the launch of Al Jazeera in the United States, and is it a good thing or bad thing?
Okay. There are two channels in the US that are problematic. One is a channel which is ironically named Peace TV. Peace TV, which has been set up by a Dr. Zakir Naik. It has two forms. It has an English version and an Urdu version. Another one is Al Jazeera. Dr. Zakir Naik is excluded from entry into the UK for being an anti-Semite and for being a supporter of Al-Qaeda and terrorism and being a racist, all-round racist. That television channel is being broadcast in the United States, and that's going out to a number of households. There are preachers such as himself, Hussein Yee is another one who's banned also from going into the UK. Bilal Phillips, who's an American, is also another regularly featured inverted commas scholar, regularly featured to espouse anti-Semitism, and I have examples of anti-Semitic viewpoints being broadcast on PCD. The real question, I guess, the one you mentioned was Al Jazeera. I believe Al Jazeera to be a Muslim Brotherhood front.
What? A Muslim Brotherhood?
Muslim Brotherhood front. Yeah, I believe that the reason for that is that, well, a number of reasons. One of the main ones is that they constantly have Yusuf al-Qaradawi on the channel regularly. I don't know, does everybody know who he is? No. Nobody knows who he is. But Yusuf al-Qaradawi believes that Jews should be killed. Yusuf al-Qaradawi won't sit with Jews. Yusuf al-Qaradawi believes that homosexuals should be thrown off a mountain. Yusuf al-Qaradawi believes that all Shiites around the world at this moment in time, because of this Syrian civil war, are legitimate targets. Yusuf al-Qaradawi, and I could go on and on and on. excluded from the UK. He is one of the main broadcasters one of the main scholars being presented on Al Jazeera. He and others. The problem with Al Jazeera is that it's got more and more legitimacy, but it is still part of this, moving the mainstream American Muslim households, and maybe non-Muslims as well, onto a particular political position which is either anti-Semitic or Islamist or even Muslim power politics. And that, I believe, is dangerous, and that's something that I believe that Al Jazeera, from concept, has been wanting to do. That may be controversial, but that's what I believe.
Yeah. First row, second row. First.
Well, anti-Semitism antedates Islam by centuries, and it's easy to object to it and feel very moral, but very few people seem to be willing to find out why is it that anti-Semitism has persisted throughout the centuries, with or without Muslims. And if you suggest that there might be something in the nature of the religion that might cause it, of course, you're on dangerous ground. But explaining has nothing to do with justifying. And it occurs to me that if you go around telling people that you are God's chosen people, they're going to resent it. If you tell people that you worship a man who is ready to kill his only son, they'll find that rather horrendous. And if you tell people that our God has promised us that if we obey him slavishly, we'll exterminate our enemies, and if we don't obey him, he'll exterminate us, which really happened. Now, again, this is the way I think other people might see it, and you don't need Muslim fanatics for that. But if you have a better explanation for the persistence of anti-Semitism over the so many centuries.
If you want to answer that,
No.
you may. Honestly, I don't think I really do want to answer this, other than to say that the gross inaccuracy of saying that the Jews worship a man who was going to kill his only son is an ignorant simplification of the story of the binding of Isaac that defies imagination in a grown adult.
But that's how others see it.
Well, I don't believe that. I really don't, and I cannot explain the mystical origin and cause of anti-Semitism is something that I spend a great deal of time thinking about, and I have only amorphous theories, and I don't think necessarily that this audience is here to hear about what possible reasons people have to be anti-Semitic. I think we could probably take as a given that anti-anything generically is unacceptable, and that we don't need to even start a conversation that might justify in some way, even if that's not what you precisely mean the thinking. I could also debate you theologically about what chosen people means, but what I'm mainly going to say is whatever the reasons for anti-Semitism, I do not believe that it's rooted in any of the things that you just suggested. That's my personal feeling. I wonder if anybody wants to chime in. I think we're better off probably diverting the conversation. Yes?
Yes, I'd like to divert the conversation completely. I agree with you, sir. I'm Dr. Polner, and you're the first person I've heard who has said that so much of this kind of inflammatory information is stemming from the United States. And unfortunately, I, as a professor, have been the victim of that. I have lost my job after 16 years because of tremendous anti-Israel feeling in much of academia. And a lot of what you're describing is coming from academia. And when you talk about taxes, we are supporting these academic institutions, but they are the very institutions which, under the supposed guide of democracy, are allowing all of this inflammatory information to come forth and indoctrinating students over and over again. And again, I'm Dr. Polner. I made a film called Brave Children of Israel, which includes Arabs as well as Jews. My website's www.challengingfilm.com, and I lecture with it. And because of that, again, I lost my job after 16 years. And I have a doctorate from this wonderful institution right here at Columbia. Thank you, and I'd love your email address if you're giving it out.
Yeah, of course, it's Haras. That's Hotel Alpha Romeo Alpha Sierra. Hotel, Haras
Yes,
at outlook.com.
at what?
Outlook.
Outlook.
Yeah, .com. You say that'll get to my BlackBerry or wherever I'm in
And
the
my
world.
email address for anybody who wants it is mp2106@columbia.edu, and I challenge Columbia to take a stand against all of this, because we are a major institution and we deserve to make this kind of a challenge. And thank you so much for coming.
No, my pleasure. I just want to add to that. Your story is not uncommon.
Yes, I know, but nothing's done about it.
Yeah, there's a friend of mine in the UK who was a professor, and a convert, somebody who converted to Islam, although I think a lot of people didn't know that, and he lost his job for a similar reason and ended up taking the first professorship of Islamic Studies in Seoul University, first chair. So, yeah, it's not an uncommon story at all.
Yes.
Thank you. Very, very interesting. You're assuming that, you're saying that the Muslim Brotherhood is Islamist, is that right?
Yes, according to their website.
A couple of things that came up. You said there's a difference between the United Kingdom and the United States in this area. Could you elaborate on that? You talked about solving the necessity for outside Muslims to solve the problem of Palestine. You mentioned solving the problem of Palestine. Could you elaborate on that? And one more. The insult to Islam of the Jews conquering, being victorious in 1948. Is that a theological issue or is that a cultural issue?
Okay. I'll tackle the third one first, so cultural. Because at the end of the day, historically, the region of Jerusalem has sometimes belonged to Muslims, sometimes belonged to Christians, sometimes belonged to a whole range of people, and it's more of a cultural factor rather than a theological Islamic position. Why? Because, as I mentioned before, any state in the world, according to traditional classical Islam, as long as the parameters of people being allowed to practice their Islamic faith the way they want to is observed, that country is a Muslim country, is an Islamic country. So Israel, I would argue, and debate with anybody, that according to the definitions of traditional classical Islam, Israel is a Jewish country, is an Islamic country, is a Christian country, is whatever. So, the 1948 war was a cultural loss for, I guess, Jordan and the local Arabs, etc., rather than for Muslims per se. Because I've been to Al-Aqsa many times, and I actually get more problems from Muslims in Al-Aqsa than I do from Jews. And it's a whole range, probably because I'm Pakistani origin, maybe because I look Jewish, I don't know. But it could be for a number of reasons. But I get more hassle from them when I'm out there. So it's an Arab cultural thing rather. People, you know, we have this view that people are Muslims. We're told that Muslims, through the media, through a whole range of political activism, that every Muslim around the world is sitting at his dining table every evening thinking, what are we going to do about Israel and Palestine? What are we going to do about Al-Aqsa? What are we going to do about Jerusalem? Muslims in the West, in the overall priority and hierarchy of things, don't really care. They care more about what their children are doing at night time when they're not at home. They care more about whether their children are taking drugs or not. They care more about whether their children are getting a good education. They care more about whether they're going to be able to pay their mortgage at the end of the day. Yes, it is a consideration because the region has, I guess, a heritage, a religious heritage. So yes, it's going to be a consideration. But in the priority, in the hierarchy of things, it's not that high a consideration. However, amongst the activists, the Islamist activists, it is. So you had one more question, I think that was about the difference between the UK and the USA. There's a book written by somebody that I know called Melanie Phillips in the UK. And she wrote a book called Londonistan. It's worth reading. I don't necessarily agree with everything in there, but the theme of it is fairly accurate.
I don't necessarily agree with everything that Melanie Phillips writes, but I will say that everything Melanie Phillips writes is worth reading.
Yes, absolutely.
And every word that she writes is worth reading whether you agree with it or not.
Absolutely. And London has, I'll give you an example. In Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood now are being hounded and being arrested, and the Muslim Brotherhood is, once again, if I'm not mistaken, to be a member of the Muslim Brotherhood is illegal, I think, these days at the moment, with the trial in Morsi, etc. coming up. The head of the PR centre for the Muslim Brotherhood is London now. So if somebody wants to contact the Muslim Brotherhood, who is an official Egyptian organisation, wants a media comment, they have to contact somebody in London. However, what that person should say comes from the USA. That's the dynamics. The intellectual thought and ideas for how Islamism can survive in the West and around the world in a modern age, 21st century, is coming from organizations in the US. I don't want to name them because I don't know whether it's fair to name them. They're not here to defend themselves. I don't know whether that's a good idea, but they are. I mean, offline I'm happy to have a conversation as to who I believe is what, who's saying what, etc. Who's doing what.
Yes.
So, if it's clear that the Muslim Brotherhood is one of the channels of Islamism, and you say that is clear, it's according to their own website, what do you attribute the active support of the current administration for the Muslim Brotherhood and all the ways in which it's been trying from its onset to assist it? From the beginning of the administration till clearly what's happening these days was the curtailing of the military aid, the curtailing of the economic aid, the pressure that's being put upon the Egyptian government and so on. Is this naivete, or is it not, or is it actual? Is it something else?
Okay. Thank you for that question. It's something that we were talking about earlier on today. I don't think I would hate to think that Obama and the administration were naive. God help us if they are naive. God help us if the leader of the free world is naive. So I guess there must be something behind it. I think it's a combination of a whole range of things. I think there's an element of political correctness. I think there's an element that believes that the Islamist active version of Islam is the default version of Islam, therefore it needs to be engaged with and supported. I think there's an element of, you know what, these guys don't like us, and maybe they're exactly the people that we should be talking to, encouraging, empowering, supporting, because if we throw lots of money and support their way, they may like us. I think there's an element of that. I think there's an element of people who are advising the administration, and if you look at their backgrounds, some of them, not all of them, but quite a significant number of them, fit within, I don't know if you saw the triangle that I put up earlier on, the thick black line. I think a number of them fit in that category, in that black line, and some of them actually were members of Islamist organisations before they came to the US and set up organisations here. I think there's an element of far left, almost grievance culture supporting of people that they believe that the Americans and British colonialism has impacted in. So I think it's a combination of all of these. I don't know, and only he can tell you, President Obama, how much influence these ideas have had on him when he was growing up. You know, in terms of his father and grandfather, I don't know. Don't know whether he was, maybe he was, I don't know, exposed to certain viewpoints. Not only he can answer that. And I think that generally there is a belief that if we're nice to these guys, they'll be nice back to us.
Could you identify it with not at this moment and so on, but at a certain point, I don't know whether anyone has done it, who among the current advisors in the administration fitted that triangle?
I know of them, obviously, I don't.
I think it would be a service. It would be a service to all of us to identify them.
Okay. Offline I'm happy to, but I don't know whether it's a good thing to be.
No, not here, but maybe through the organization or something.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm contemplating that with myself. I'm not sure I agree with that entire answer, and I definitely think that I don't agree. I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, and I've talked a lot in my last few years with people high up in the administration about some of the problems where these issues would come to bear. And I actually don't adopt the premise that there's an Islamist tinge inside the influential corners of the White House. We can debate that point, and you may know that some people, I don't think that's that characterizes even some of the usual suspects, such as the current head of the National Security Council, Susan Rice, or the United States Ambassador to the United Nations, Samantha Power. I don't think that they are very liberal, and there are, and I think ultimately naive as well. I would use the word naive. I'm not afraid to use it here in this context. I don't think it's a politically incorrect word. I think it's an accurate word. But I think there's something else a serious theme that you didn't mention. There is a trap that's very difficult for any American government, but the Obama administration has particularly stepped into the trap. The Bush administration was on the verge of it once or twice also. And that is, we are all Democrats with a small d. And we all believe that democracy is the ideal form of government anywhere in the world, and including the Middle East. But democracy as a be-all and end-all in the sense that we give credence to any elected government at the moment, no matter what the philosophy of that government is. If a overtly terrorist government is elected, some administrations find it very hard not to support that government. And that, I think, is a
Hamas is an example that's
a
often
serious
cited
mistake.
by...
The Hamas election in Gaza was a problem. We wanted those elections. The Israelis wanted to slow the process up. We wanted to speed the process up, and we ended up with a mess in Gaza, in my opinion.
And I think also people sometimes mistake the whole concept of democracy.
And I'm saying that even though I have a strongly pro-Jewish point of view and a pro-Israel point of view, which I won't hide, I'm saying that from an American and a democratic point of view, it created a big problem for us.
They call it terrorists.
Yes, they're terrorists, and the fact that they were democratically elected and persuaded people to a large extent, impoverished people on grounds of charitable help and so on, those are problems that do not necessarily require a pro-democratic American government to give support to a so-called democratically elected group of terrorists. That's exactly what I'm saying. Okay, yes?
So I don't think like Dr. Mr. Rafiq is referring to anyone like that, like Susan Rice,
No, I'm not.
or ambassadors, anyone like that. I believe he's referring to advisors on the Muslim world to the president, particularly the advisor to the representative to the OIC and other advisors on the Muslim world. And those in particular have had a very marked influence. I think that's what he means.
Okay, that's well taken, and I wasn't insinuating that anybody actually thinks that Susan Rice or Samantha Power are Islamists, but they are very influential and they're very liberal, and so the tinges that he described, but that's completely well taken.
And just to add to this a little bit, Shlomo, I was recently in South America, and Shlomo Ben-Ami, who's a moderate Israeli politician, told a group in Argentina that the only friend that Israel has in the Americas, the only real friend that Israel has in the Americas, is Canada. And I was on a speaking tour organized by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Canada, and I can assure you that the Canadian government is having fits at the policy and the engagement of the Obama administration and some of its leading advisors on Islamic affairs. And Canada, which is a democratic country, and I would argue is in many ways more liberal in the true sense of
100%.
the United States of America, is very concerned at the foreign policy of the United States.
Yes.
Well, it seems to me though that should be so narrowly focused on elections. When we ourselves would not accept the Constitution without a Bill of Rights, and I think those of us who are right-thinking did not accept America as a democracy until after the Emancipation Proclamation. And we were doing a lot of electing up until the Emancipation Proclamation. We're doing a lot of voting and a lot of electing up until that point.
Everyone was
I think
democratic.
that should
Yeah,
happen.
that's what I was gonna say.
So-called democratic electing. And I think if we need a lesson to understand democracy, I think democracy is a set of institutions, and not simply one of those institutions is election, but certainly a set of institutions, including the protection of minorities. And one would expect the leadership of this country to be able to articulate that more better and more better.
Yeah.
But no, I think it's really a problem, because I think this trap that you describe in some ways is a straw man trap. And if we articulated it just in a slightly more sophisticated version of
One not so sophisticated way, but convincing way to describe it is that Hitler was democratically elected.
Exactly.
Yes.
I would like to point out that I find it
Please
very-
louder, please.
I would like to point out, again as Dr. Polner, that I feel very sad that there are so few students in this room, that if you go into the classrooms of Columbia as well as CUNY, you will find so many anti-Israel professors who are propagandizing these students. If you go out on the Low Library Square, you will see huge signs that are anti-Israel in nature. And I find it incredible that we don't have students here, and we're not bringing them in, and they are being educated by these people who are basically educating them for
Well,
hate.
I think I'd also like to deflect the conversation. This is a particular topic. The point's well taken.
Thank
I'm a
you.
member of the Columbia faculty. I think my credentials as being strongly.
I totally agree. I have also taught at
But
Columbia.
I think we're not talking tonight about. We all know what the
I was
culture is
commenting
in
on the
major
fact that there are
American
so few
universities,
young people here.
and it was well publicized.
Yes, it was.
Students, it's 4:30 in the afternoon. We can't do this in the middle of class day. And
I'm not
I
blaming
too would have
you, sir.
expected and hoped it was well publicized that we have people from the community more than we have students, to say the least. And I regret that, and I'm not quite sure what to do about it. Students were fully informed of this program. A lot of programs come through here, and they pick and choose, and maybe this one didn't look controversial enough.
I'm suggesting that Chakotri propagandized before these kinds of events that they never get here. That's my suggestion.
I think this one was, okay, yeah.
Just that I'm a member of I'm a member of the ISGAP, proudly a member of the ISGAP board, and I want to take a more optimistic perspective, which is, I think it's fantastic that we're here, that ISGAP is here. 5 years ago, you wouldn't have had, 3 years ago, you wouldn't have had this. I want to thank Charles for all the hard work that he did. We are here.
And we have no pickets.
We are here, and this is the inaugural.
Look at the cup of porter full.
Those of us who are faculty as well, and your faculty, and for those of us who are faculty, will point out the existence of this on the website, so Columbia students will be able to see your lectures. A lot more will see it than are present here tonight.
Yes.
through the website. And as has happened in other universities, I am sure that the presence of ISGAP talks will grow exponentially as it has everywhere else where we have had a foothold in. So I'm more optimistic, and I thank you for being the inaugural speaker.
Yeah.
I follow the New York Times pretty carefully, and it seems to me that they support the Muslim Brotherhood. And I just wonder if you have some comments about that.
I would make the same comment that I made before. They are trapped in the democratically elected governments rather than directly supporting the Muslim, in my opinion. And I think the New York Times, any negative implication that I said had about it might have been misinterpreted about either Samantha or Susan Rice, both of them are good friends of mine. I completely withdraw and apologize for that. I didn't mean it in the sense that you said. The New York Times, I'm willing to say anything.
Because what they do is they do not emphasize the Morsi's abrogation of democracy when he did. They minimize that, and they dwell on the fact that that they want a coalition. Now, they want a democratic process. So they're deliberately minimizing Morsi's departure from democracy. They won't talk about what he did with the courts and he took judicial authority.
Right.
And so they do this, and if you read it carefully, you see this. So, this is also following the administration approach to Egypt.
Yeah.
So what is going on here?
The
Brotherhood and their values are antithetical to all the New York Times values, regarding women, gays, and everything else. Yet, they're going in this direction, and as a spokesgroup for the administration.
We have a similar problem in the UK with The Guardian. With The Guardian newspaper, exact same problem. Their values would very much seem to be antithetical with, the values of the Muslim Brotherhood. The homophobic values, the anti-women, the sexist, misogynist values, the racist values that Islamists promote throughout the world are at a complete opposite spectrum of what one would expect The Guardian to believe and support. And yet they wholeheartedly, full-blown, and I've been having numerous debates with them in the UK for the last 7 years or so, are not just from the elections, but even before the elections, were supporting and still continue to be supporting Islamists, because they've almost, I can speak for The Guardian, my own experience with The Guardian, I'm not sure what's happening here in New York, but they certainly have fallen into the trap that they believe that Muslims as a whole are under attack, and that if somebody attacks Islamists, they're attacking Islam. Therefore, they don't want to be seen as being Islamophobic. Therefore, they see themselves as the defenders of Islam, when in actual fact, the first victims of Islamists are other Muslims. And they're the ones, I think Charles mentioned, said, they're the ones that are Islamophobic. I would say that Islamists are Islamophobic.
I add a theme to that should not go. We're talking strategically about how one deals with this, because this is we're talking about a cancerous problem in the world right now. I don't think that's an exaggerated way to put it. It's out of hand, and it's dangerous, and it's going all over the place. One of the things that you can do is figure out a way to create some outrage. And how come the international press doesn't focus more than a drop on the treatment of Christians throughout the Muslim world? Because Jews are tiny by comparison. The number of persecuted Christians is far greater than the persecuted Jews.
And yet there's a Charter of Rights, again we were stuck at this earlier, Charles and I have lunch, there's a Charter of Rights which sits in a monastery in Syria, which has the second largest collection of Christian relics outside of Rome. And there is a Charter of Rights there which has been signed by the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, which basically says, and I'm paraphrasing that, anybody who fights with Christians, anybody who tries to threaten Christians, anybody who upsets them in any way is upsetting him, therefore upsetting Muslims, therefore Christians are to be supported, their enemies are Muslims' enemies around the world, and this charter exists from now until the Day of Judgment. And yet, Christians are being, you're absolutely right, persecuted in the Middle East, much more than, I guess, Jews aren't being persecuted as much because most of them have migrated.
There's not very few of them inside Muslim countries. Israel is the surrogate.
Maybe Morocco, maybe there's a few in Morocco.
Except in Morocco, generally the king is a great protector.
That's right.
of the Jews in Morocco.
Perhaps it's a lot safer for their reporters to be on the side of this.
That's very interesting. Whatever it is, I don't know. The New York Times, I think, you don't need to read a lot in the New York Times to come to the conclusion. It's ubiquitous. But to come to your conclusion, you don't really need to read. You know what you need to do? You need to look at the front page pictures. Look at the front page pictures selected to deal with the Middle East. And if there is a terrorist attack followed by a retaliation, no matter how mild, the front page picture will show some innocent Palestinian child. I regret the fact that some of these children are caught up in this mess, who's been scared or cowering in the corner or injured. It does not show the victims of terrorism, ever. when Judy Redoran, who's the current Israel correspondent to the Times, was appointed, I met with her and had a, I thought that was my job to there's a lot of expressions, nothing helps, but I thought it was important to try to establish it. And I said something very simple to her. I said, of course you should write objectively, fairly, and here are all the ways in which I think you would be able to improve the Times reporting on the Middle East. But more than that, see if you can have some control over the selection of headlines and pictures. If you could just change the headlines and the pictures to be neutral.
That's not her responsibility, that's the editor.
That's what she said, but I said it's your responsibility, maybe, it ought to be your responsibility to see what tone is set in your article, and the tone gets set by the pictures and the headlines as much as it does by what's written. Yeah.
I've just wondered, and I've been trying to get my head around this for the last many years around university culture having to do with radical chic. It seems to me that when I went to school, here in the early 70s. There was
How early in the 70s, when it was still hot on campus, so
Yeah.
it started to cool off?
Well, it was still hot. And there was a fascination here. I was at City College as well. And there was a fascination on both campuses and an adoration, actually, of Mao Zedong at the time, by much of the faculty, which was understandable at the time, but it was an adoration that was never reversed, never apologized for, never was there a sense on campus that the untold tens of millions who were killed as a result of this totalitarianism. And this idea that the faculty fascination with totalitarianism on the one hand, as long as it was firing, and simultaneously an absolutely rigid attitude towards the slightest abrogations of what's considered freedoms in the United States, seemed to me in itself a kind of a racist dichotomy.
Yeah, no question about it. And a double standard of the most extreme dimensions.
I think also universities are a place that people explore radical ideas, and I think that it's also a place for students to be rebellious, and to be rebellious against the established, perceived rebelliousness against the establishment is something that I think has historically happened around the world. The Islamist or the hate speeches, preachers that are coming around preaching is a little bit more different, because although communists, Mao Zedong, etc., they killed people, sort of, in the Far East, etc. It didn't really, to my knowledge, that I can blow any let off any bombs in Times Square or anything. The problem we have here with what's happening now, the consequences for here in the US are much more dangerous. And I think that's why some counter-narrative is extremely important, and we're not getting that.
I actually would add, and this will characterize my view of academia to an extent anyway. William Buckley may have said the single most profound word about governance and politics that I personally have ever heard. William Buckley said, on the whole, I'm not going to imitate his accent, although I can. On the whole, I would rather be governed by the first 3 pages of the Boston telephone directory than by the Harvard faculty. Yes?
As a lawyer, one of your functions is to reconcile conflicting values, and you mentioned the problem of democracy. What do you do, it's an old conundrum, when the majority decides to execute a minority? What principle is involved? Is there a natural, use the doctrine of natural law to override the principle?
Oh, well, I think that's over my head. I'm a tax teacher, not a philosopher. But
Damn.
yeah, I think that there's, I know an atrocity that has to be the Trump democracy when I see it. I can't describe it. I know pornography when I see it, and I can't describe it. Well, in the back there was a.
Yes, I have a comment, since my area of specialty is studying the campus. My area of specialty is studying the campus. Again, I'm Dr. Polner, And my thesis today is that the major dating service is not the internet, but it's going out and rebelling on the square. That's the best place for boy to meet girl. And they jump up and down and they make a lot of noise. And this young man is smiling in the front of the room. And they get together and they become very, very powerful. And that's the meeting place for boys and girls nowadays. And I think that doesn't get studied and it never gets talked about. But that's why we have so much of this.
You know that they said something very similar. I'm a Southerner, and I'm born and raised in the Deep South. They said something very similar about the civil rights movement.
Oh, that may be true.
That it was a social gathering. I think it was much more than that and accomplished the
Oh, that may be
absolutely
true,
essential growth in American democracy. But it was a byproduct was that it was a great social scene.
Absolutely. And we have to study that and do something about it.
Is there a question back here somewhere? Okay, I think maybe we ought to thank Haras Rafiq for he deserved a bigger audience, but he got a quality audience instead. And if more had come, the quality would have diluted. Thank you. I thank Charles also for bringing ISGAP here, and we'll have more programs.
On behalf of ISGAP, thank you, Haras Rafiq, and thank you, Professor Stone.